And I will introduce again Catherine Zakoian to this evening's conversation with CAGT. So Catherine, I'm going to let you take it away.
Thanks, Miranda. Okay, I'm going to pull up my slide deck here. Can you see that?
That looks great. Thank you.
Well, I'm honored to be here at this evening's event, Conversations with CAGT, and I'm delighted to be talking about this topic, about being having an empathic nature. And I want to just start by saying I realize I titled this "Feeling the Pain of the World," and we'll definitely touch in on what that means. But for the purposes of this evening, my focus is going to be on helping gifted empathic children and adults start first within themselves and then within their family, and then from those places moving that out to other environments like school and community and the world. And hopefully that will make sense to everyone as we move through the content. So I want to start by just going through some things that I feel are helpful things to begin with. And I'm going to kind of read us through these, but this is how I look at empathic nature and capacity. I think that all humans um, have access to having an empathic nature. There is some adjacent contemporary research that perhaps provides ways of understanding this. And at the end of the talk, I'm sharing some resources and research that might be very interesting for you to take a look at that underscores this. Um, Essentially, being empathic generally means that you have a felt or known experience of other people or institutional um, feelings or well-being or dysregulation or regulation, conflict or intelligence or motivation. So these are the people in the world who can kind of tell how somebody's feeling, even if that person's not expressing it. They might even have an understanding of what they're experiencing or what they're thinking. And the word empathy sort of encapsulates that. We can sort of have empathy for somebody maybe who's going through a difficult time, but an empath actually has a sense of that difficulty somehow in their body or their knowing. Organizationally, and I see this all the time in my practice, children have a response to their educational environments, particularly when there is conflict or dysregulation, but no one's talking about it. So it might be an organizational piece, like I've seen where there've been sort of a drastic exchange of leadership kind of mid-school year, but the empathic children have been feeling that. But they, couldn't articulate it because they didn't really understand it. They just felt it. And then all of a sudden it makes sense. Somebody's dismissed, for example, who's in a leadership role. Gifted perceptivity and sensitivity, which are kind of key components of being gifted, amplifies empathic capacity. Because we're so perceptive and generally sensitive, we just have a sensibility that allows us to sort of see and pick up things that are happening around us at an acute level, keen level. Twice exceptional children and adults, through their accommodation, particularly when it's self-accommodation, when they haven't been evaluated yet, those twice exceptionalities can sometimes also magnify empathic capability or capacity. In particular, and this is just anecdotal from what I see in my practice, I think children and adults who have central auditory processing disorder often have to figure out how to read what's happening in the classroom or in a work environment because they can't take everything in because the background noise is too much. So they end up sort of sharpening their empathic skill. And then when we run other institutional sensibilities through our own nervous system, so when we're sensing something but we don't quite know what it is, or it's not clear, it's not a clean read, it results in an intense emotion, reaction, or withdrawal on our parts. So for example, and it's never really clean across. So like for a child in a classroom where there's another child who's really struggling with something very difficult. That child might be feeling sad, the child who's struggling. And then the gifted empathic child might actually be feeling something close to anger or anxiety. It's not a clean read. They just can pick up that something feels suddenly not right. Um, Same with institutional sensibilities. When our workplace has got something going on, our work circle, our school environment, we can feel it, but we don't always know it. We don't know exactly what it is. And then interestingly, to me, is that the most empathic children and adults among us are often the ones who seem the least empathic among us because they've had to accommodate and kind of insulate themselves because it could sweep them away. It's pretty overwhelming. So often parents will come to, to inquire about working together, and they'll have a description of one child who they call their empathic, child who's sort of loving and kind and wants to help. And then they'll have another child who they describe as being sort of unplugged, not tuned into other people, pretty even critical, or uh, maybe even pushes people away. And often that child is the most empathic of the group. And we're going to touch a little more deeply on that here in a moment. So they can get easily swept away. So they have to withdraw or sometimes outburst or both. Interestingly, and again, anecdotally, I find that the adults who come to me, and this is often the parent of a child that I'm counseling, who's super empathic, but in their childhood put together a brilliant coping strategy of, sort of walling themselves off a little bit. Often they anchor themselves to things that are seemingly more concrete. So things like mathematics, data, science, engineering, analysis, electronics and gaming sometimes fits in that category. Critical thought and critical speech. And when I say critical thought and critical speech, it's not necessarily the classic critical thinking. It's more being critical of what's around them. And these are the children and adults that really need our understanding, support, and sanctuary. And I'm going to give us some guidance on that tonight too, because I want to make sure we include them in the conversation because they often get left behind. So the wonderful thing about having an empathic nature is that once we can befriend it, it becomes our ally and it's no longer a burden. And for most gifted people that I've worked with, adults sometimes have some of this happening when they've already moved some of it to ally, but sometimes they haven't. But children hardly ever experience it in any other way but as a burden because there's so much happening. It happens really fast, and they just don't know kind of how to sort it out. So these are just some guiding guidelines that I think are helpful for you to know as parents, or if you're an empath yourself, or if you're an educator working with empathic children. So having an accepting parent to talk about these experiences and be reflected. And we're going to talk more about reflection here in a moment. Gaining understanding through experience of difficult environments, events, and people. So this is, helping your child know what people and places are challenging for them. I typically use the example of Costco. Sometimes you go in as a family, you come out, and there's just a lot of distress on the ride home. It's often because there's so much happening, and there are people like often just trying to get in and out, and they're short with each other, cutting each other off with carts and such. That there is a lot of like stuff that empathic people pick up on. School environments often are really difficult environments for kids. Kids who've studied hard for a quiz or a test will often report that they like get into the actual test and they can't perform. And it's often because their classmates around them have a lot of stress. So if you can imagine however old your school building is, 50 years of that same level of test anxiety, still floating around within that environment on some level, that's a lot. Another place, and I'm not being critical of churches, but churches often are difficult places for empaths because there's a lot of grief and pain. In addition to some of the, joy and such that come through a church, there's often, a lot of sadness too and worry. So it's just helpful to have these conversations with your children, with yourself, around what environments are difficult. And we're going to talk a little bit about this next one, which is building grounding and clearing skill, so that you are able to go into those buildings and be part of those communities without having it sweep you away. And then finally here, building trust in yourself, and especially in children via reflective and parent encouragement, not praise. So I want to stop here and talk about reflection. I mentioned it in the first guideline. So reflection is an amazing part of parenting, but a lot of parents, and I see this with gifted parents a lot because they want to make sure they're doing everything right, because they're kind of perfectionistic like their kids. They often don't take the time to just reflect what's going on for a child. Instead, there's a tendency to step in and advise or direct or question what's happening versus just reflection. And there's a couple ways to reflect that can be really helpful. So the first is feelings reflection, which is just taking guesses on how children might be feeling. You got kind of quiet when I picked you up from school today, and I'm wondering, I'm just going to guess maybe you felt a little bit fatigued or maybe a little sad. And then they can accept or reject that. And you're building their emotional feelings vocabulary at the same time. And if they accept that, you can add more reflective questions to it versus, well, what's wrong? It's more so you feel a little sad. That's a way to reflect, right? And then hopefully more will come back with that sort of pitch or prompt. Content reflection is just reflecting back what a child is saying or doing so that they can tell and feel and hear and see that we see and hear them and notice them. So that first part that I used in that example, when you got into the car, I noticed you were quiet. That's a straight up reflection. If they say, I am sad because I was left out today of something something that was really important to me. And you just say that back. You were left out of something that was really important to you. And eventually they'll probably tell you what it was. But if we go right to what was it? Tell me about it. We miss all that opportunity to reflect. The reflect builds trust in self and an internal, intrinsic quality for a child, which will be very helpful for them, particularly if they're empathic. And then parent encouragement versus praise. This is really important because we have a tendency in our culture, because we've been sort of under the behavioral model of sort of parenting and educating that has like rewards and punishment that's associated with it. We have a tendency to sort of praise one another versus encourage one another. So to say to a child, the next day after they handed in a project, I was thinking about that project you just worked on, you just handed in, and I noticed how you took your time, like selecting your topic, selecting your materials. When you got a little stuck, you maybe even got a little discouraged, but then you figured out more of what you wanted to say. That's far more valuable to your child in that moment, but also in their inner world than saying, good work, nice job, you rocked it. So I wanted to share that. And then I'm going to move over to some more parent strategies here that include the reflect and encourage, because I went a little bit deeper into that on the last slide. But here's some other things you can do to support the gifted empathic child. You can trust and talk about your own intuition. Talk about the hunches you have. Talk about the feelings and sensibilities you have, just as if they were part of, because they are, your human experience. So let children hear that. And you don't have to follow it up with, do you have intuition like that? Do you ever experience that? Just tell them. This morning, there was something that I said to myself on some level, I don't think it's a good idea to run that errand. I think I'm going to wait a couple of days, or till tomorrow. And then sure enough, like, had I not been home and free, I would have missed this opportunity that came my way. Or let them know, like, I followed my intuition, I followed my hunch. You're introducing that into the conversation, um, and into their world in a really normal, natural way. The next one is really important from my point of view. If you can recall what I just said about the empaths who have to lock it down and often gravitate towards an anchor like math or science. When I'm working with a family where one or both of the parents have that kind of an anchor for themselves, which again is a brilliant coping strategy because it allowed them not to be swept away as children. But when those adults have children, almost always those children are not like that. So they're running um, the parents who are not expressing their feelings. Instead, they're tying themselves to things like the data. If they're not saying their feelings, those empathic gifted children are running those feelings through their own nervous system as their own because they're going unacknowledged, unexpressed by the parent. So it's just a simple acknowledgement to yourself. I'm feeling frustrated right now. I'm feeling sad right now. I'm feeling excluded right now. If you had a rough day, just name that to yourself and how you're feeling about it. And be kind to yourself, even if you don't have the words. If you can, share with your partner too, and just see how that feels. And then watch what's happening for your child. Some of that withdrawal or some of that outbursting you might see with them, which again is what happens when we're running somebody else's feelings through our nervous system. They come out almost always in sort of an angry or anxious way versus the direct correlation to what, or the direct sort of match up to what the other person's feeling. So that is just one tool to just try right away. It's very helpful. And it will also help you, if you are that kind of an individual, to sort of unravel or untangle or unknot some of that anchoring you've done. So you have a fuller capacity for your feelings. The third strategy is asking, and this is a great thing to teach empathic children, but only if you have done this yourself for a little while with your own empathic capacity, because you want to be credible when you talk with your children about it. So you want to have the experience yourself. So asking, when you're feeling something very strongly, is this my feeling? Or does it belong to someone else or something else? 30 minutes ago, I was feeling fantastic. And right now, I feel so sad. And I can't trace it to anything in particular that I've just experienced. So is this mine or does this belong to someone else or someplace else that I was? And do that detective work. And when you become more practiced at it, you can start to introduce that to your children. You can do it all together. And it's a great thing to do, like in the car, before you go into Costco, right? You're going to do some of the grounding and clearing I'm going to share with you here in a moment. But when you get back in the car, you do like a temperature read. How's everyone feeling? Is it yours or does it belong to somebody else in the store? And again, nothing against Costco, but find public places like that because you'll be around a lot of people and it'll give you an opportunity to experiment with it together safely. This next guidance is working with the elements to ground, clear, reinforce, and I'm going to cover that in more detail in a few slides. We've already talked about reflecting and encouraging versus questioning, directing, advising, and praising. I should add, of course, it's part of your job as parents to question and direct and advise at times and to praise. I mean, sometimes we only have time for a quick, good job or nice work, but to circle back and stretch that out and allow that to become reflective and encouragement. And then create sanctuary at your home. It's really important because the world is a difficult place to be when you're an empath. And if you have a soft landing spot that's reliable and lovely at the end of your day, it makes all the difference. And I'm going to give you some really specific guidance on that towards the end here of my talk. And then explore the related resources and research, which again, I'm going to share some more with you about that at the end. trusting and talking about your intuition. I feel like I covered that really well, but sort of like this tree, you have a lot of experience with your intuition, and allow your children to see this. And at some point, you might even share with them a little bit about your own childhood intuitions, if they're things that might be helpful, including their grandparents, because often it's fun for kids to hear that there are other people in the family who have these same capacities. Naming your feelings, we talked about this. So important. I want to share one more thing about naming your feelings with you that I have discovered is a really helpful tool as parents of gifted kids, but it's just a helpful human tool. Anger is typically not a primary emotion. It's typically a secondary emotion, and there's something underneath it. So it can be a wonderful exercise. And I would do this for yourself first before you introduce this to your child. But you want to figure out all the things that can be underneath anger for you. And I think a really simple way to do that is to draw on a piece of paper a line, and above the line you write the word anger, and below the line you write all the things that can be underneath there. And that can include things like sadness and worry, and feeling hungry, feeling tired, feeling afraid, feeling excluded, feeling this happens a lot for gifted people, feeling stupid. Right? We knew something, but we forgot, or forgot to say something. And for parents, often feeling disrespected is under there. And start to sort of circle constellations, circle the ones that fit with your family, your children, or your partner, circle the ones that have to do with work, circle the ones that have to do with your own relationship with yourself, when you get angry with yourself, and get really clear on what's underneath the anger, so that when you're naming your feelings to yourself, you can actually be more specific. And if you haven't been doing this, it's okay. What you might have to do is, after you're angry, like the next day, then do this detective work. And then you'll be able to get that closer and closer to the actual experience of the anger. Like, I'm feeling angry, but it's because I feel like I let myself down, or whatever it might be. And then when you feel like you've got a bit of a handle on this, introduce this exercise to your children. Usually kids really enjoy it, especially if you're willing to share what happens for you. We talked a bit about this already, and I think I'm going to leave it there. Asking, is this mine, or does it belong to someone else? Oh, there is one more thing I want to share about this. And I write about this in my book quite a bit, about, well, a bit about empath nature, but I did put a little list in my book of kind of the things that you see, things that are sort of earmarks of when a child, or we as adults, have all of a sudden been impacted by something else. And this is what I see. So I want to share this with you, but you'll see a disorganized behavior. So all of a sudden the child will just be like out of sorts and really can't really zero in or focus in on something. They're more scrambled than they ordinarily might be. You also often, this happens for adults too, like all of a sudden it's like just hard to kind of zero in on what you need to be focused on. There's other stuff that's pulling you in different directions. The other thing you might see is uncharacteristic language, which can be really shocking from a child, but you might see them using like really strong, aggressive, like cuss, swear language. Same with adults. If it comes out of nowhere and it's not your ordinary like way, that's often a sign that you've been impacted by something outside of yourself. Escalated anger or anxiety that seemingly comes from nowhere, out of nowhere, but it flashes up. A difficulty calming, like beyond the ordinary time frame that might take you or your child to calm. Confusion, that's pretty profound confusion, and again, uncharacteristic. Tearfulness or sadness that's sort of sudden without any obvious cause. So these are the things to watch for yourself and for your child. And then I want to spend some time here with us, and I'm going to do a time check. So I mentioned this earlier, and I want to give you some good practical guidance here. So I like working with the elements to give empaths, children and adults, a way to start to ground themselves and clear themselves when they have been impacted, when they could potentially be impacted or they have been impacted by something outside of themselves that they've picked up. I think elements are a nice way to start because if you think about like what we need in our human body to survive, we need oxygen, we need air, we need water, which is the second element. We need salt or sodium, which earth is an element. We need potassium, which is like the fire, right? So working with those air, water, earth, and fire elements, it makes sense to kids. And it's very simple too, because we usually have access to these things. So very quickly, the earth is a really great place to ground. I mean, it's the same thing, earth and ground. So to just feel your feet on the ground, even if you're inside a building, just feel your connection to the earth can be really helpful. But it's also really helpful to just be outside on the earth. So when the weather is warm, you can go outside with your children or yourself and be barefooted. When the weather is cold, you can still go be, standing on the earth in the snow and have those benefits. A lot of gifted kids like to collect gems and minerals and rocks. So sometimes kids that I work with will actually have a rock or a gem or a mineral that's really important to them that helps them ground. I would recommend if it's an important item to them, not to put that in their school backpack, but to come up with one that they can bring to school, that it would be okay if it got lost, to keep in their locker or their backpack, just to even hold on as a touchstone literally during the day. And you can gain strength and grounding from the rocks and from the earth, but you can also send the distress out of your body into the earth through your feet or by holding on to that gem or rock. Water is a really simple one. You can wash your hands, and we actually in our language, we say things like I need to get grounded, or I'm going to wash my hands of this matter, right? So there's even, songs about washing your hair, to get rid of, something that's not pleasant anymore. So using water when you bathe, when you shower, with some intention, and allow that water to take away any stress from the day or anything that doesn't belong to you from the day, and then to bring in what is you, what is lovely about life for you. But even just washing your hands midday, while you're washing your hands, just allow the water to take those things away, and then to bring in the lovely things to you. With air, and this is kind of a fun one for kids, but some gifted kids have sensitivity to high winds and they don't like the sound of it, especially young kids. But if they don't mind being out in the wind, just do a little exercise with them, when you're outside, and just say, let's let this wind take away any stress we have in our bodies and our thinking. And then once we feel clear, let's have the wind bring in all we love about life. Right? So you're sort of refreshing yourself with the breeze. Fire is one that I don't think is really helpful for children to be working with fire, but I love to recommend for families that you do, I call them like Friday fires. So if you have a hearth or a fire pit, that's great. But if you don't, you can just use a candle and a holder that's safe, and then just light it at some point on Friday when you're all, if that's your family schedule or whatever day when everyone's together. And you light the fire and you sort of symbolically allow it to burn away any stress anybody picked up at work or at school during the week. And then also to be a place where you can talk about what you want to call into your family time going into the Friday evening and the weekend. It's a beautiful practice, and it's a lovely way to sort of create a clean slate. Move this into, talked about this already, reflect and encourage. Then I'm going to move us into creating sanctuary at home. Again, the world is such an intense place sometimes. And it's just really nice to create that soft landing for ourselves and our children. So these are just my top things to consider when you're looking at creating sanctuary at home for gifted and twice exceptional people, as well as, you know, empathic people. But I think it's really helpful for all humans if we can make this happen and make it work. But our nutrition is so important, and our water source is so important. So, and our drinking water is so important. So, you know, keeping an eye on clean nutrition and clean water, I think, is really helpful. Clutter in homes tends to be really difficult for empathic kids. But what happens is sort of like the sort of science engineer, mathematics empath, some empathic people ground themselves by having stuff and material stuff. It's kind of the way they anchor. So there's a lot of interesting, I think, connection between clutter and empathic capacity. And I think it's helpful to have a living environment, a home environment that is intentionally clutter free if possible, and to do your best to kind of do that. But I know that's that could be its own topic for the gifted and twice exceptional population, because there's a lot there. Being careful what toxins come in your house, particularly cleaners, household cleansers and cleaners. I mean, I know a lot of us and a lot of kids can't even walk down that aisle in the grocery store where all the laundry detergent and such is stored. So you need to sort of pay attention to that in your home as well. Also, other toxins like alcohol and cigarettes, things like that, try to minimize that in the home. It's very, very helpful for empaths. For children who are empathic, who live with somebody has an addiction like alcoholism, um, they're constantly sort of scanning the environment because of the alcoholism or the other addiction. So that sort of ramps up the empath capacity for a lot of people. So it's just one thing to consider. In a home for an empath, I think it's really helpful to encourage a love of learning versus achievement. There's a lot to say around that, but high achievement is sort of the nemesis of love of learning for a lot of gifted and twice exceptional people. And there's more in my book about this, but it's just a helpful thing to consider in a household. You also want to take a look at who's an introvert and who's an extrovert in home, and find out what everybody needs for their downtime so that everyone's getting the things they need. You want to have a focus on reading and talking and building versus media and electronics, if possible. It's more constructive. It's just more heart opening and fulfilling and safe for people who are empathic and gifted and twice exceptional. It's really helpful to have family rules. They keep them simple. I have a nice section in my book about that. I don't want to create a long list. It's usually just 2 or 3 things. And family meetings are another great way to create that connection and to have those difficult conversations, but also those really wonderful conversations and connection points. You want to develop healthy relationship to competition in your home, and a healthy relationship to perfectionism. With competition, I have this in my resources, but I think Alfie Kohn does a really beautiful job of describing the detriments of competition and how important it is to teach children about competition, but not necessarily how to be competitors all the time. And with perfectionism, I think creating a culture of mistake making is really helpful to create that sanctuary. So just like you're talking about your intuition in an impromptu, off the cuff way, you want to be talking about the mistakes you make in life, not the big messy adult ones, but the ordinary everyday mistakes that we all make. Say them out loud so your children can see how graceful and gracious you are with yourself. This next one's a little tender for a lot of gifted people, but I want to share it because I just find it's a really important distinction. Sometimes when children are feeling the pain of the world, they want to get in there and roll up their sleeves and help, because they feel like they're just one person and they don't have a lot of voice as a child, especially, and they want to get in there and help. That is beautiful. And at the same time, you have to be very careful that it's not put in a category that's like an achievement category. So if we are honoring a child for being an excellent volunteer, we're on that same slippery slope of praise. We have to make sure we're encouraging it versus praising it, because if we praise it, it becomes an extrinsic motivator for them. And so then their internal motivation gets a little offline or doesn't have a chance to develop properly. So if a child really wants to work a neighborhood cleanup day, the next day you talk about, like, I noticed that you really looked around to see what needed to be done. You talk about the actual things they did versus how great it was that they're saving the world. Does that make sense? Okay, great. You also want to look at your own um, sort of relationship to authority and clarify what that is, so that in your home you have a safe place for people to be able to talk freely, even if they need to say, this doesn't work for me at school. This doesn't work for me with parenting. This doesn't work for me with some of my friends, and I don't know how to resolve it, right? Because when we go straight to, like, the authority is the expert, sometimes it undercuts the child's capacity to talk through with their parents what it is they're experiencing and what it is they need. Go to resources. So here are a few resources for you. Here's a picture of the cover of my book, Raising Gifted Children. I have a copy here too with me tonight. Stephen Porges' work on the polyvagal theory is fascinating. It's essentially beautiful work that talks about how we're constantly scanning our environment for safety. And I think it fits really nicely with this kind of conversation about empath capacity. Mirror neuron research has been in motion since the late 80s, early 90s. It's really fascinating about what happens to us as humans when we see other people behaving in different ways. Microchimeric cell research has also been going on for quite some time, but this is fascinating. It's actually um, chromosomal cells that are typically masculine are found in mothers after they've given birth to sons. So it shows that there's, like, for some people, for some time, some connection. And of course, then for daughters and mothers too. But there's some sort of cellular piece that's also happening that's connecting to people, a parent and child in this case. And then this book is a wonderful, well, it's actually a really difficult read. It's kind of harsh, but it's a great book. It's called The Gift of Fear, Survival Signals That Protect Us from Violence. Gavin DeBecker, I believe, worked for the FBI and then became a private security expert. And it's a wonderful, clear description of how important it is to keep our intuition online, and how, again and again, he explains how people will not trust their intuition and sort of the outcome that comes with that, and how important it is to keep children's intuition alive for their own walk in the world, particularly around safety. So again, it's hard to read. He wrote a second book that's specifically about parenting that's also excellent. Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer's Extraordinary Knowing is also a really good book for this topic, because it talks about, she's a scholar, and she puts together a lot of the sort of research that has been done in this area very, very nicely. Judith Orloff has done some interesting work. She is somebody who works out of UCLA, or did work out of UCLA Medical School. And then Alfie Conan mentioned, these are the two books that I think are most helpful for parents, but he's got wonderful other books and other resources that you can find on his website. I think this is the point. Thank you.
Thank you for putting your web address up there for us and the book again. I was going to make sure that I made sure that you talked about the book again and talked about your website. I appreciate you sharing all those strategies and tips. Gosh, as we see if there's any questions that come in. We don't have any yet. It was really thorough. I felt like everything was very well explained. So I feel like a little bit more empowered. Um, and not just as a parent, but also as an educator, because I was thinking about, as you were talking about, like creating the sanctuary in the home, about creating a sanctuary in a classroom, about recognizing those students in my classroom. I wrote down here, I said, we think about the empaths as the readers, the poets, and the artists, but maybe they're the mathematicians and the scientists.
Yeah.
Like maybe those are the kids that I think about the kids that get home and they kind of just like everything just kind of bleh out of them because they've been holding it in all day. And I think of those kids so often in my work with gifted kids as well, and like in my classroom now, that the kids that whose parents go, oh my gosh, they come home and they just like it all just blah, and it comes out as anger and frustration and those kids, I think about those kids, those parents that told me, and I was like, oh yeah, those are my STEM kids. you know those aren't my artists or my poets. I mean, it's not that those can't be, but it's a fresher way of looking at it, and it makes a lot of sense because they find sanctuary in order and logic and reason and things that can't be often misinterpreted.
Yes, that's so beautiful that you're tracking that, Miranda. And it, yes, I agree. And that coming home and just like having it just, sort of blow. And if you think about, I mean, it is a brilliant coping strategy to anchor yourself to things that are, interesting to you, but also there aren't many people talking about their feelings during that kind of work,
Mm-hmm.
the kind of work than having a literature conversation with children. So that brilliant coping strategy then allows them to kind of hold it, right? They hold it together at school. And then there's got to be a place. And I wonder if there's a way to bridge that after school by just saying, like, it's part of the debrief after school. Like everyone just talk, kind of like that Friday fire,
Yeah.
everybody just talks about like what we might be carrying home with us that needs to be released.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The anxiety at the end of the day. And I think about, like, as an educator too, like how do we hold space for those kids in our classroom, particularly in a time when behaviors seem to be increasingly challenging in the classroom, and yeah, those kiddos that are empathic. How do we as educators help cope? um it's quite the task, but I realize that so many of us are definitely, as educators and parents, need to kind of step back and hold that space for them, and be aware and cognizant of those feelings and those emotions and reactions and or lack of reaction.
Yeah. I this last October I presented at CAT on that topic, like empathic child, empathic teacher, because so many educators are super empathic. They come to the work because they really want to make a difference. And so um, what I find fascinating, and this comes a lot of my consulting work, but the educators often are, they're in a parallel process with the students, you know,
Hmm.
and there's just a lot going on for the teachers and for the students.
Yeah.
And there's just so much that's happening.
I
Actually,
think the awareness probably at least gets you. I think just being aware helps out as an educator, like being acknowledging that.
yeah, for sure.
We do
Imprint.
have a question. It just
Oh,
came
oh,
up. Rebecca Hubbard. So she says she's kind of talking about those blow ups after school. And she said, what happens when, and sorry, it jumped me to another page. What can you do in those moments of with the like release after school, the kind of the blow up, the like let out of all that emotions, when all the strategies are being rejected? Like they won't take a shower and like wash off the day. They won't deep breathe. They're so far gone emotionally that it's hard to reach them. And then when those, she kind of furthered that to say, and then when those feelings are affecting, other children, um, and you just can't give space for it to blow over. What are some suggestions you might have to support? Because I think a lot of us have had that kid that just comes home and is just
Yeah.
so far gone. We what can we do to support them in that moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple of things I'd recommend. One, having this conversation with your child, not in one of those moments.
Mm-hmm.
So starting this conversation at a time, and I would actually make it sort of special time, like not contrived, like you're trying to trick them or anything, but like, not that you would be doing that, Rebecca, but take them out for a tea or coffee like hot chocolate, and say, I'm noticing this happens for you at the end of the day, and um, I just want you to know you're not alone. A lot of people go through that at the end of the workday, at the end of the school day, but it's my job to like sort out what would be most helpful for you, so we can get through it. Because I'm glad you're bringing it home, because that means you feel safe at home to let this happen at home. And your child's not going to really know. So you can offer up some of those suggestions. Here's what I know is helpful for other people. Taking a bath, taking a shower, spending time with the dog, drinking some water, having a little protein, um, taking a little time to yourself, privately if you wish, um, reading something you love. So you're offering up suggestions, and just get their input and say it's really important that you're part of this, and talk about yourself too, like what you do, had a rough time, and what's most helpful for you. That will go a long way. And then the other strategy, and this, I have this in detail in my book, but when children spin out, again, it's the highest compliment they can pay, is to say, I can tell you of something important you're trying to tell me, but I can't understand it in this way. I need to understand what's going on. So when you're feeling a little bit like you're a little more sort of calmer or settled, we'll talk and we'll try to get to the bottom of it. Because in that talk, you want to find out what happened during the day. Was it a social dilemma that was really, really painful? Was it an academic dilemma? Is it a school mismatch? Is it what is underneath there? Or is it all of that? Because then you have all this intelligence you can start to work with. You also want to start looking for any unevaluated, unidentified twice exceptionality. Sometimes that's at play. Kids are just exhausted by the end of the day. So you want to start looking for some of those telltale signs. And
We have another question too that kind of like leads into that, like, those behaviors and gifted behaviors, twice exceptional behaviors, how they're presenting. And Christy asks, are there specific signs or things to watch for that might be typical to GT intensity, sensitivity, and empathy, but that warrant getting into counseling or seeking outside help? Like, at what point should, as parents, I think what she's kind of asking is, at what point as parents should we say, okay, these are typical GT behaviors, or these are typical twice exceptional behaviors that are emotional, representations of those exceptionalities. Or when should we say, we've tried these strategies and we're still noticing these behaviors or these attitudes, and at what point should we kind of say, we need to maybe get some external support?
yeah, such a good question. I think a few things that I think are important to say here. One is, kids are often, gifted kids, twice exceptional kids are telling us when they need to talk about something, because they're doing the same thing and it's not getting any better, kind of what you just described. And I think we have to pay attention to that. Gifted, twice exceptional kids can really benefit from counseling. And if you go to somebody who's a counselor who works with gifted and twice exceptional children, they're going to see that it's not just that the child has anxiety or the child has intensity. They're going to be able to kind of work underneath that and see what's going on underneath that that needs the attention. And sometimes that is a choice exceptionality that hasn't been evaluated, and they'll see those earmarks, they'll see those signs, and can hopefully and can help a parent connect up to those resources to have those things evaluated and some intervention. Um, Especially when children are saying things like, I hate my life, I wish I wasn't born, why was I born? I just want to die. They're telling us that they need some support. And um, those those are in my experience and just in talking with colleagues, those are messages we want to pay attention to. Um, Also, messages of "I'm so stupid" are ones we want to pay attention to. The other piece I want to make sure I say is um, it has to be presented to a child in a way that doesn't feel like punishment or like there's something wrong with them. Because gifted and twice exceptional children and adults like, can almost always benefit from some kind of support, extra support, as we know, academically, social, emotionally. And I think finding the right match in a counselor is going to offer that to your child and your family. But it has to be presented in a way, especially if your child's perfectionistic, that it's something that helps and that it's just an important part of being human and growing up and being gifted. And that it's something that other people do, and maybe you've done it and you're doing it yourself, and then it's really helpful. And that the process is for everyone, not just for that child. That as a parent, you'll have just as much responsibility in looking at how you're parenting in order to make your home the sanctuary that's going to be most meaningful for the child and the family.
I think those were two really good questions.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, trust your intuition on this. As you're interviewing counselors, trust your gut as a parent. If you're like, no way, listen to that. And I know I said it's important to go to a counselor who understands giftedness, but there are some really good counselors out there too who don't, but who may be wonderful matches on other ways, and they're willing to do that homework on the giftedness too.
I think that's helpful because it is hard to know when like, okay, when can we just like understand this is part of their gifted behaviors, and when do we need to maybe be more concerned about, deeper emotional stuff that's going on. But I'm just to check really quickly to see if there's any more questions.
Add one more thing about gifted counseling.
Absolutely.
If you're working with the right match, the process is pretty fast. As long as a child hasn't experienced something that's been like really traumatic, like a car wreck or death of a immediate family member, like a parent or sibling, divorce, I put in that category for a lot of kids. As long as the child hasn't experienced like that level of experienced distress, gifted counseling work is pretty fast in my experience. Like it's not like an adult like therapeutic process that might take a long time. Children just don't have that much to unpack unless they again have had something that they're adjusting to, like a death. That's a different kind of work that might be a start and stop process for several years as they developmentally understand their grief. But for the kinds of things that we were just talking about, it's usually a pretty fast.
And that's good to think about too, is that, and for the children to understand going into it that, this is not permanent. This is not forever. This is something that we want to help you with what you're going through right now. And if you need to come back to it later, that's absolutely perfect. Like that's absolutely fine and warranted. But I think sometimes kids feel like a permanence in those kind of decisions, or those kind of, and to understand that like, hey, this is not.
Right. And like in my practice, the focus is on like, what's the life you want to create? What, like for the child, like what's holding you back? Because you've got bigger fish to fry, like what is it you want in your life? And so right off the bat, they're not feeling like there's something wrong with them.
Mm-hmm.
But but I genuinely feel that way. So, and that's, kind of my part of my clinical orientation. Like, I find the right person.
Right. So I want to, if anybody has any more personal questions or more like in-depth, like very like much um, dealing with your own children's specific needs or anything like that, you can reach out to Catherine. Your website is, does you have contact information on your website?
I do, yeah. You can reach me.
I will put her website here in the chat for anybody, just so that you have the direct link. So that will be there in the chat for anybody who would like to access that. And it popped up a picture of your book too. So um, really appreciate your time tonight. It feels like it went a lot faster than it did. Like it feels like the hour just went by. But it was really good to see you again. It's been a few months and we're just happy to have you. And really quickly, I'll just do a quick plug for next time. Our next one isn't until March 5th. We have Mark Hess hosting Lisa Rogers, and she's going to be talking about developing mathematical thinking in gifted learners through routines. So this might be a great one for parents of students who are gifted in math, or for teachers who are math teachers of gifted students. So join us on March 5th with Mark and Lisa. And again, Catherine, thank you so much for being here this evening and giving us and being so giving of your time and efforts. And everybody be sure, if you're interested in this presentation, to check out her book on Amazon. And we're just so grateful to have you, Catherine, and everybody else will bid you good night.
Thanks, Miranda. Thanks, everyone.